Millionaire kept firing maids until one touched his heart with a gift for his sick daughter. And before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel because here, every story carries a lesson you'll never forget. Also, tell me in the comments from which city you are watching this video. I'd love to know how far these stories are reaching. It all began in the grand mansion that towered over the city like a monument of pride. The owner was a man known for his cold heart, his ruthless standards, and his unshakable authority. No worker ever lasted long within those walls. Maids came and went like shadows, dismissed for reasons so trivial it seemed almost absurd. One spilled a drop of water on the marble floor. Another dared to leave a speck of dust on a crystal vase. Each mistake was punished with the same sentence: dismissal. That night, the sound of thunder rolled through the sky as yet another woman in uniform walked away from the house in tears, her hands shaking, her dignity broken. She had lasted barely 2 weeks. He watched her leave without the slightest trace of regret. To him, she was just another failure, another reminder that perfection was a standard few could meet. But what the world didn't know was that this cruelty wasn't only about keeping his house spotless. It was about keeping his own soul hidden, covered in layers of arrogance. He had built a fortress of rules and punishments to mask a truth he could not control, a truth that haunted him every night. And as the storm raged outside, a faint sound echoed through the mansion's upper floor. A child's cough, weak, fragile, carrying a pain that no amount of wealth could cure. It was the one thing in his life he couldn't dismiss, couldn't fire, couldn't replace. It was his deepest wound, the one secret no outsider was meant to see. But soon someone would. And when that moment came, everything he believed in, his pride, his power, his certainty, would begin to collapse. The storm outside had not subsided, and perhaps it never really mattered. Inside the mansion, silence was both a companion and a punishment. The man, whose wealth had carved out his empire and bought him respect in every corner of the city, sat alone at the edge of a long table, staring at the flickering reflection of the chandelier on his untouched glass of wine. People envied him, feared him, whispered about him. Yet behind the walls of his palace, there was no laughter, no warmth, only the cold echo of footsteps and the endless cycle of servants coming and going, fired as easily as one might brush off a speck of dust. But not everything within those walls was as controlled as he wanted the world to believe. Upstairs, hidden away from prying eyes, was a room where curtains remained drawn even during daylight, and where toys were scattered like fragments of a forgotten joy. On the bed, a small figure rested, thin, fragile, with skin paler than the sheets. Her head, once crowned with golden curls, now revealed the cruel truth of an illness that had taken not only her hair, but also her childhood innocence. She was only 10, yet her eyes carried the weight of battles far older than her years. He visited her every night, never missing a moment. Yet even in those visits, there was no tenderness, no soft words, only silence. He would sit by her bed, sometimes holding her hand, sometimes saying nothing at all. She never complained. She never asked him for more. But in the silence, her longing was evident. She wanted comfort. She wanted normalcy. She wanted to be treated as a child, not as a fragile possession locked away in a gilded cage. He loved her more than life itself, but he did not know how to show it. He had been taught to rule, to command, to demand perfection from everyone around him. Affection, for him, was weakness. So he built his love like he built his empire, hidden behind walls, guarded, unspoken. The staff knew about her, though most had never seen her. They whispered about the little girl with cancer, the one thing the millionaire could not control. Some pitied him, others judged him. All the money in the world, they said, and he can't save his own daughter. But no one dared say it to his face, not if they wanted to keep their jobs. And so, the cycle continued. One maid after another, dismissed with cruelty, until the mansion itself felt like a haunted place. Rooms polished to perfection, yet devoid of warmth. The workers came to fear not just the man, but the very air inside his house, as if stepping into it meant carrying a curse. Still, fate has a way of testing even the hardest of hearts. The next maid who crossed his path was not like the others. She was quieter, perhaps, but there was something in her eyes, a resilience, a dignity that poverty had not stolen. She entered the mansion not simply for wages, but with a deeper purpose, though no one could have guessed it at first. Her hands trembled the first time she touched the cold marble floor, not out of fear, but out of the weight of responsibility. Unlike the others, she did not flinch when he glared. She bowed her head, but not her spirit. For her, this was not merely work. It was survival, and survival meant enduring humiliation, if necessary. But even she had no idea that soon her path would cross with that fragile child in the hidden room. And in that single encounter, something remarkable would ignite, a clash between arrogance and compassion, between pride and humility, between wealth and humanity. And when it happened, it would shake the mansion to its very core. The next morning arrived not with sunshine, but with the dull gray light that seeped through the mansion's tall windows. The staff walked in silence, their footsteps muffled by the heavy carpets, each one aware of how fragile their position was under this roof. They whispered among themselves as they passed the grand staircase, casting glances toward the man who had just entered the hall. His eyes, sharp and cold, swept across them like a blade. One wrong move, one misplaced gesture, and they could be dismissed before the hour was done. Among them was the new maid. Her uniform clung awkwardly to her frame, a little too large, as if borrowed from someone else. She clutched her cleaning supplies close to her chest, her head bowed, but her eyes carefully observing every corner of the mansion. She had heard the stories, of course. Who hadn't? Everyone in town knew the millionaire's reputation. They said he was merciless, that no woman had lasted long working under his gaze. And yet, she had accepted the job anyway. Not because she believed she could impress him, but because life had left her no choice. Bills waited at home, an empty fridge, a younger brother in need of medicine. Poverty had sharpened her resilience. Fear, for her, was a luxury she could not afford. Her first task was simple, or at least it should have been. The grand dining hall was already spotless, polished until it gleamed, yet he demanded it be cleaned again. She wiped the same surface over and over, her hands trembling not from exhaustion, but from the weight of his presence. He sat at the end of the table, reading a newspaper, his silence heavier than any words. Every few minutes, he would glance at her, his eyes narrowing as if searching for a flaw, a mistake, a reason to unleash his wrath. "Don't leave streaks," he finally muttered without looking up. Her heart skipped, but she didn't stop. She pressed the cloth harder against the glass, steadying her breath. "Yes, sir," she whispered. There was something different about her tone. It wasn't submissive in the way he expected. It wasn't defiance either. It was steady, almost calm, as though she refused to let his cruelty break her spirit. He noticed it, though he didn't say a word. He was used to fear, to stammering apologies, to trembling voices begging for another chance. But this one, she simply continued, silent and precise, as if she belonged there. Later that day, as she carried fresh linens up the staircase, she passed a door she had been told never to open. The others had warned her, "That room is forbidden. Don't even knock. If he catches you near it, you'll be gone before you can blink." But as she walked by, a faint sound reached her ears. A cough, small, weak, then another. She froze, her heart tightening. It wasn't just a cough. It was the sound of someone in pain, someone struggling to breathe. She hesitated, her hands tightening around the folded sheets. Curiosity tugged at her, but fear held her back. One step closer could mean her job. The door creaked suddenly, just a fraction, as if someone inside had moved it by accident. She caught a glimpse, a pale face resting on pillows, eyes too large for such a fragile frame. A child, bald, sickly, yet still managing to hold a doll close to her chest. Their eyes met for a single second before the girl quickly turned away, embarrassed, as though she wasn't supposed to be seen. The maid's heart ached, but she forced herself to move on. Not yet, she thought. Not today. She couldn't risk it. That evening, As she left the mansion, the storm clouds gathered once again. Her body was exhausted, her spirit weighed down by the tension of every glance, every word. And yet, something inside her had shifted. That tiny glimpse of the child behind the door had awakened something she could not ignore. For the first time, she understood why the air in this mansion was so heavy. It wasn't only his cruelty. It was sorrow, hidden, locked away, buried beneath pride and anger. She knew she was walking on dangerous ground. One mistake, and she would be gone like all the others. But a voice inside her whispered that her path in this place had only just begun, and that the moment she dared to step through that forbidden door, everything would change. Not only for her, but for the child, and even for the man who thought his heart was untouchable. And the day was coming sooner than anyone expected. The mansion awoke before dawn, as it always did. The rhythm was strict, calculated, orchestrated like the gears of a machine. No one dared to be late. No one dared to step out of place. The staff moved like shadows, careful not to make noise that could disturb the master of the house. But even the silence seemed heavy, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of fear. The new maid walked slowly through the corridors, her hands red and sore from hours of scrubbing, her uniform still damp from the chores of the night before. Yet there was no weakness in her steps. Her gaze lingered on the forbidden hallway upstairs, on the closed door where she had heard that cough the previous day. The image of the little girl's fragile face haunted her. She told herself to stay away, to follow the rules. But compassion has a way of pushing against fear, of making disobedience feel necessary. Her chance came sooner than she imagined. She was sent upstairs with a tray, tea, bread, and a porcelain cup of milk. One of the older maids whispered nervously as she handed it to her, "Don't look inside. Don't say a word. Just leave it by the door." But when she reached the forbidden room, the door was already ajar. The cough came again, louder this time. She hesitated, her hand frozen on the tray. Then a weak voice called out, fragile and trembling, "Is someone there?" The maid's breath caught. For a moment, she thought of turning back, of pretending she hadn't heard. But the voice came again, more desperate this time. "Please don't go." Her heart ached. Slowly, she pushed the door open. Inside, the curtains blocked most of the morning light, but enough seeped through to reveal the child sitting up against the pillows, her small shoulders shaking with the effort of each breath. The doll lay abandoned beside her, and her thin fingers trembled as she tried to pull the blanket tighter around herself. The maid stepped inside, her voice gentle but unsure. I brought your breakfast." The girl's eyes lifted to meet hers. They were wide, tired, yet filled with a spark of curiosity. "You're new," she whispered. "Yes," the maid answered softly. She placed the tray carefully on the nightstand. "I'll just leave this here." But as she turned to go, the girl's small hand reached out, clutching at the air. "Wait, can you stay? Just for a moment." The maid froze. She knew if he found her here, if he discovered she had broken the unspoken rule, she would be gone before the day was over. But there was something in the child's eyes, loneliness so deep it seemed to echo through the room. Against every warning in her mind, the maid sat on the edge of the bed. They said little at first. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the girl's uneven breathing. Then, in a voice almost too soft to hear, the girl asked, "What's your name?" The maid hesitated. "Maria," she finally answered, though her real name trembled on her tongue. Perhaps it was instinct, perhaps it was fear, but she knew she had to protect herself somehow. The girl smiled faintly, her lips trembling. "Maria, that's pretty." She paused, her eyes drifting to the doll beside her. "Do you think I look ugly?" The question struck like a blade. The maid's chest tightened as she glanced at the bald head, the pale skin, the shadows beneath the child's eyes. She swallowed hard and shook her head. "No, you're beautiful. More than beautiful. You're brave." Tears filled the girl's eyes, but she smiled through them. No one had told her that in a long time. Not even her father, who visited but could never seem to say the words she most needed. The door creaked suddenly. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. The maid's blood ran cold. She jumped to her feet, her heart pounding as the shadow appeared under the doorframe. The handle turned. Her throat went dry. If he walked in now, it would all be over. Her job, her chance at survival, everything. The door began to open. The door opened with a slow, deliberate creak, like a warning. The maid's chest tightened. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She wanted to move, to hide, to vanish into thin air, but her feet felt nailed to the ground. The girl's tiny fingers gripped the blanket tightly, her wide eyes darting from the maid to the looming shadow in the doorway. And then he appeared. Tall, imposing, his presence filled the room before a single word left his lips. His gaze, sharp and unyielding, locked on the maid. For a moment, the silence was unbearable, stretched so thin it felt like glass ready to shatter. He didn't need to shout. His eyes alone were enough to strike terror into anyone who stood before him. "What?" he said finally, his voice low and venomous. "Are you doing in here?" The maid swallowed hard, her trembling hands gripping her apron. I was only—" Silence. His voice cut like a whip. He took a step closer, his polished shoes echoing against the wooden floor. "You were told. You were warned. No one comes into this room." The girl stirred, her voice fragile but insistent. "Papa, don't be angry." I asked her to stay. His expression faltered for just a fraction of a second, but he quickly masked it with a scowl. "You don't know what you're asking," he muttered, though his tone lacked its usual certainty. "She was kind," the girl whispered, her eyes pleading. "She didn't look at me like I was broken." The maid's heart twisted. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she had only meant to bring comfort, but his eyes silenced her again. He turned on her with fury. "Get out. Now. Before I—" But then he stopped. Something caught his attention. The way the maid stood, not begging, not sobbing, not trembling as so many before her had done. Her chin lifted slightly, her eyes steady despite her fear. She wasn't defiant, but she wasn't crushed either. There was dignity in her silence, a strength that unsettled him. It reminded him of someone long gone, a face from years ago, one he tried to bury under layers of work, wealth, and anger. For a moment, his own mask slipped. The man who commanded empires, who dismissed servants as though they were nothing, now stood frozen by memory. But he caught himself and straightened, his tone sharp once more. "Leave this room and never return. If I catch you here again, you will regret it." The maid lowered her gaze, her hands clenched to hide their shaking. "Yes, sir." She turned to leave, her footsteps heavy with the certainty that her dismissal was only hours away. Yet, before she crossed the threshold, a soft voice called after her. "Will you come back tomorrow?" the girl asked. The maid froze. Her breath caught. Slowly, she turned her head, meeting the child's hopeful eyes. The father's gaze burned into her, daring her to answer. She hesitated, her lips parting as if the truth might slip out. But then she bowed her head and whispered, "If I can." The man's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. He should have fired her on the spot. He should have shouted, dragged her out, made an example of her. But he didn't. Something in his chest stirred, something he didn't want to feel. That night, long after the staff had gone to their quarters, he stood by the window of his study, staring out at the storm that had returned to the city. The lightning illuminated his reflection in the glass, a man who had everything, yet felt hollow inside. He thought of the maid's eyes, steady, unafraid. He thought of his daughter's words, the way her voice trembled with hope. And for the first time in years, doubt crept into his mind. Doubt about his rules, his cruelty, his walls of perfection. But doubt is dangerous. It makes even the strongest men weak. And weakness was something he had sworn never to allow. Down the hall, the maid lay awake in the servants' quarters, her thoughts restless. She knew she had crossed a line, one that could cost her everything. Yet she couldn't shake the image of the girl's smile, fragile yet radiant, as if her presence had given her a moment of peace. Both of them knew something had shifted in the mansion that day, and neither of them would ever be the same again. The mansion had always been a place of rules. Strict, cold, merciless rules, etched not in stone but in fear. Yet ever since that moment in the forbidden room, those rules had begun to bend in ways no one could have imagined. The maid woke the next morning with a weight on her chest, certain she would be dismissed before noon. But the hours passed, and no order came. No summons to the study. No words of punishment. She worked in silence, each sweep of her cloth accompanied by the whisper of dread, waiting for the hammer to fall. But instead of fury, there was silence. The master of the house said nothing. He watched her more closely, yes, his eyes narrowing whenever she passed, but he didn't utter the words she expected. It was as if he was testing her, waiting to see if she would break the rules again. And deep down, she knew she would. The girl was waiting. By midday, while carrying a tray of folded linens, the maid found herself once again before the forbidden door. This time, there was no hesitation. She knocked gently, a soft rhythm against the wood. "Come in," the small voice called. The room was dim, curtains still drawn against the sunlight, but the atmosphere felt different now. The girl's eyes lit up at the sight of her. "You came back," she whispered, a fragile smile tugging at her lips. "I only have a moment," the maid said, closing the door behind her. "If your father finds me here." The girl shook her head quickly. "He won't. He doesn't stay long during the day. He's always busy." Her eyes dimmed for a moment, and her voice cracked on the last word. The maid's heart ached. She sat beside the bed, carefully arranging the linens as though that were her only purpose. "How are you feeling today?" The child shrugged, her thin shoulders lifting weakly. "Tired. Always tired. But it's better when someone talks to me." She hesitated, then added, "I don't like being alone." The other maids, they never stayed. The maid glanced down at her hands, remembering the stories she had heard in hushed whispers. 5 women had already come and gone in a matter of months. All fired, all broken by the master's wrath. But perhaps what no one understood was that it wasn't only him who had suffered from their leaving. It was the girl, left behind, abandoned again and again in her silent prison. "Then I'll stay," the maid said softly, surprising even herself. "For as long as I can." The girl's eyes widened, and for the first time in weeks, she laughed. It was a fragile sound, thin and raspy, but it was laughter nonetheless. Days turned into weeks, and their secret meetings became a fragile lifeline. Whenever she could, the maid found excuses to enter the room, changing sheets that were already clean, dusting furniture that hadn't gathered dust, carrying tea the girl barely drank. Each visit was a risk, but each visit brought a spark back to the child's eyes. They talked about little things, flowers the maid had once grown, the smell of rain, the sound of music drifting from the city streets. Sometimes the girl would close her eyes and imagine she was anywhere but here, free, alive, running barefoot through grass she had never touched. But there was one thing she asked for more than anything. "Do you think I could have hair again?" she whispered one evening, her fingers tracing the smooth skin of her scalp. "I want to look like I used to, like in the pictures Papa keeps hidden." The maid's throat tightened. She had no answer. All she could do was squeeze the girl's hand and whisper one day. What neither of them noticed was the shadow, standing just outside the door. The master of the house. His hand was clenched on the handle, his jaw rigid. He had returned earlier than usual, curious about the whispers among the staff. And now he stood there, listening to the forbidden laughter of his daughter, hearing the softness in her voice that hadn't been there in months. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar, a pang of jealousy. Not for wealth, not for power, but for the comfort a stranger had given his daughter, a comfort he himself could not. He could have stormed in. He could have ended it all right there. But he didn't. Instead, he closed the door quietly and walked away, his chest heavy with emotions he refused to name. That night, he sat alone in his study, staring at the dying fire. His mind raged with contradictions. Part of him wanted to dismiss her, to erase the threat she posed to his control. But another part, smaller, quieter, whispered of the change he had seen in his daughter's eyes. The maid was breaking the rules, but she was also breaking something else, the walls he had built around himself. And soon, the cracks would be too wide to hide. The tension in the mansion grew heavier with each passing day. The staff noticed it in the way the master's footsteps echoed louder through the halls, in the sharpness of his gaze whenever his eyes fell upon the new maid. He hadn't dismissed her yet, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time. He never let anything slide for long. The others whispered in the kitchens, their voices low and fearful. Why is she still here? What makes her different? But no one dared ask him. The maid, meanwhile, felt the storm brewing even before it arrived. Each morning, she woke with a knot in her stomach, bracing herself for the inevitable end. Yet she couldn't stop herself. Every day, she found her way back to the forbidden room, answering the child's smile with one of her own, trading small stories for fragile laughter. With each visit, the girl seemed less like a shadow of illness and more like a child again, still frail, still fighting, but glowing with hope. It was during one of these moments that the storm finally broke. The maid was braiding ribbons into the girl's doll's hair, her hands careful and gentle, when the door swung open violently. The girl gasped, clutching the blanket to her chest. The maid's head snapped up, and there he stood, her employer, the man whose wrath had destroyed so many before her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes burned like fire. "I warned you," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "I told you never to enter this room again." The maid rose slowly, her heart pounding. "She asked me to." "I don't care what she asked." His hand struck the side of the doorframe, the sound making the girl flinch. "This is my house, my rules. And you," he stepped forward, his shadow engulfing hers. "You are nothing more than a servant." The words cut deep, but she refused to lower her gaze. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the courage it took to speak. Maybe so, but no servant, no stranger, no human with a heart could ignore a child who is suffering. His jaw clenched, his breathing heavy. "You dare lecture me in my own home?" "Yes," she whispered, her eyes steady. "Because someone has to." The silence that followed was unbearable. The girl's small sobs filled the air, tears streaming down her pale cheeks as she looked at her father. "Papa, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Don't send her away. She's the only one who makes me feel normal." For the first time, his composure cracked. His eyes flicked from his daughter's tear-streaked face to the maid's defiant expression. 1,000 thoughts warred in his mind. Anger at being challenged, shame for what his daughter had said, fear of losing control. His whole life had been built on the idea that nothing and no one could break him. And yet here he was, shaken by the words of a fragile girl and a woman who should have bowed to him like all the rest. Finally, his voice dropped, heavy and bitter. "Leave us. Now." The maid hesitated, wanting to reach out to the child, but the weight of his stare pinned her in place. She gathered her courage, nodded slowly, and walked past him. But as she brushed by, she whispered words so soft only he could hear them. "Money can buy obedience, but it cannot buy love." He froze. His hand tightened into a fist, but he didn't turn to stop her. The words echoed in his head long after she was gone, like a curse he couldn't silence. Behind him, the girl wept quietly into her pillow. He stood there, rooted to the spot, torn between his pride and his daughter's pain. For years, he had convinced himself he was untouchable, that no act of compassion could breach his armor. But tonight, he felt the cracks spreading wider. Later, alone in his study, he poured himself another glass of wine he didn't drink. The fire burned low, shadows creeping across the room. He thought of the maid's eyes, her steady voice, her audacity to speak truths no one else dared. He thought of his daughter's desperate plea, and for the first time in his life, he wondered if perhaps he was the one who had been wrong all along. But admitting that would mean tearing down the empire he had built, the pride, the control, the image of perfection. And he wasn't ready. Not yet. Still, deep inside, he knew the battle had begun. And this time, it wasn't about wealth or power. It was about his very soul. Days turned into a fragile rhythm, one built on stolen moments and hidden glances. The maid no longer needed excuses to linger near the forbidden room. The girl had grown bolder, calling softly for her whenever the hall was quiet, her frail voice echoing through the silence of the mansion. And each time, the maid answered. She came with little offerings, a folded paper flower, a story about the world outside, even a ribbon she tied gently around the doll's wrist. They were small things, almost insignificant, but to the girl they were treasures, reminders that she was still seen, still cared for. The millionaire noticed. He noticed everything. At first, he tried to ignore it, telling himself he had more important matters to attend to, meetings with investors, acquisitions, numbers that always obeyed him. But no matter how high he built his empire, the sound of his daughter's laughter reached him through the cracks of his walls, piercing deeper than any business rival ever could. It unsettled him. It angered him. And yet, it also drew him in. One evening, as he passed her door, he heard voices. His daughter's light giggle and the maid's gentle tone. He stopped, his chest tightening against a feeling he couldn't quite name. Jealousy? Fear? Or was it something more dangerous? The realization that love, the one thing he could never command, was slipping through his fingers to someone else. Inside, the girl was asking questions. "What's it like outside?" she whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. The maid smiled softly. "It's noisy, busy, people rushing, cars honking, music from the streets. But there's beauty too. Flowers pushing through cracks in the pavement. Children chasing each other in the parks. Life everywhere, loud and imperfect." The girl sighed dreamily. "I wish I could see it, even just once." "You will," the maid replied firmly, though her heart ached at the lie. She had no power to promise such a thing. But hope was sometimes stronger than truth, and the girl needed hope more than anything. That night, the maid slipped quietly back to her quarters, unaware that she was being watched. From the shadows of the hallway, the millionaire stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had listened to every word. His mind raged with contradictions. Why was she giving his daughter promises she couldn't keep? Why did his child look at her with a kind of love she had never shown him? And why, despite his anger, did he feel a sting of envy, as though her compassion exposed his own failures as a father? He retreated to his study, pouring himself another glass of wine he wouldn't touch. The fire flickered in the hearth, its glow reflecting in his eyes as he stared into the flames. The maid's words echoed in his mind, colliding with his daughter's laughter. It was unbearable. He wanted to banish her from the house, to erase the source of this torment. But then he saw his daughter's smile in his mind, brighter than it had been in months. Could he really take that away from her? The struggle inside him grew darker with each passing day. The maid, too, carried her own burden. She knew she was walking on the edge of a knife. One wrong step and her livelihood would be gone, her chance to feed her family shattered. Yet every time she saw the girl's fragile face light up at her presence, she couldn't stop herself. She returned again and again, even knowing the risk. It was during one of those visits that the girl made a confession that broke the maid's heart. "Sometimes," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, "I think Papa is ashamed of me. Because I'm sick. Because I don't look like I used to." The maid reached for her hand immediately, holding it tight. "No," she said, her voice fierce. "You are not something to be ashamed of. You are his treasure. He just doesn't know how to show it." Tears filled the girl's eyes. "But you show it. You don't even know me, and you make me feel like I matter." The maid's throat closed with emotion, her own eyes stinging. She brushed a tear from the child's cheek and whispered, "Because you do matter. More than you know." At that very moment, the door burst open. The millionaire stood there, his expression carved from stone, his presence like a thunderclap in the room. His eyes locked on the maid's hand clasped around his daughter's, on the tears glistening in the child's eyes. For a long moment, no one spoke. The fire in his stare was enough to silence the world. The girl gasped, tried to sit up. "Papa!" "Enough," he said, his voice quiet but dangerous. He stepped inside, each movement deliberate, controlled. His gaze never left the maid. "Get out." The maid's chest tightened. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but one look at his face told her it would be useless. Slowly, reluctantly, she rose to her feet. She brushed her hands on her apron, steadying herself, and walked toward the door. But just as she passed him, his voice cut through the silence again. "You will not see her again." The words struck harder than any shout. The maid froze, her back to him, her heart breaking. She wanted to scream, to argue, but the child's quiet sobs behind her stopped her. She couldn't make it worse. She walked out, each step heavier than the last. Behind her, the door slammed shut, and inside the room, the little girl cried. Not because of her illness, not because of her pain, but because the one person who had made her feel alive had just been taken away. The millionaire stood rigid, his fists clenched, his chest heaving with unspoken rage. He told himself he had done the right thing, that he had restored order, that his rules had been preserved. But deep down, beneath the armor of pride, he felt something else. Guilt. And guilt, once awakened, does not rest easily. The mansion was quieter than ever. Not the natural silence of wealth, but the suffocating stillness of grief. After the maid had been barred from the forbidden room, the girl changed. At first, it was subtle, a heavier silence during meals, a longer stare at the floor, the absence of the small laugh that used to slip from her lips when she spoke to her secret companion. But soon, it became undeniable. She refused her meals. She turned away from her nurses. Even the doll, once always at her side, lay abandoned at the foot of the bed. And when her father came in, as he always did, to sit in the stiff chair by her bedside, she refused to look at him. "Eat," he commanded one evening, his voice clipped, placing the tray closer. "I'm not hungry. You must eat." "The doctors said." "I don't care what the doctors said." Her voice, though weak, was filled with steel he had never heard from her before. His jaw tightened. "Don't speak to me that way." Finally, her eyes snapped to his. There was no fear in them, no meek obedience, only hurt and fury. "Why? Why should I respect you when you took away the only person who made me feel like I wasn't dying?" The words pierced him more deeply than any insult ever had. He had faced rivals, enemies, entire boards of directors who tried to break him. None had ever succeeded. Yet here, in the trembling voice of his daughter, he felt himself undone. "She is a servant," he said, his tone shaking despite himself. "You don't need her. You have me." "No," the girl shouted, her voice cracking into sobs. "I don't have you. You sit there and stare, but you don't talk to me. You don't laugh with me. You don't even see me." She saw me. She talked to me. She cared. Her sobs filled the room, heavy, ragged. He reached out instinctively, but she jerked away from his touch, turning her back to him. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless, truly powerless. That night, he couldn't sleep. He paced his study like a caged animal, haunted by his daughter's words. Every shadow in the room seemed to whisper the same accusation. "You don't see her. You don't love her the way she needs. You only know how to control." But the voice of his pride fought back. "She is your daughter. She will obey. She is young, fragile. She doesn't know what she's saying." And yet, he couldn't escape the image of her turning away from him, her tears staining the pillow, her body curling inward as if to shield herself from his presence. The following days were worse. The girl refused to eat at all. She refused medicine. She refused even to look at him. Her condition weakened rapidly, and panic rippled through the staff. The doctors warned that she couldn't go on like this, but he refused to listen. He told himself she was stubborn, that she would break, that he could wait her out. But then came the night he found her crying softly into the darkness. He stood in the doorway, unnoticed, listening as her fragile voice whispered to the emptiness. "Please come back. Please. I just want to see you again. Please." She was speaking to the maid. His heart clenched painfully in his chest. He wanted to turn away, to leave, but his legs wouldn't move. He leaned against the doorframe, fighting the storm inside him. Rage, pride, guilt, sorrow, all colliding until he thought he might shatter. The next morning, as he sat at the head of the massive dining table, untouched food before him, the weight of the decision pressed down harder than ever. He could call the maid back. He could break his own rules for once, give his daughter what she needed. But doing so would mean admitting weakness, admitting he had been wrong, and he had never admitted wrong in his life. The mansion's air grew colder with each day of his silence, until even the servants dared to whisper less. The girl grew weaker. Her eyes, once bright with defiance, now dulled with exhaustion. It was then that fate delivered its cruelest blow. During the quiet hours of dusk, When the house seemed wrapped in shadows, the girl collapsed. Her body gave way under the weight of her refusal, her lips murmuring a single name. Not her father's, but the maid's. Panic ripped through the mansion. The staff screamed for help. The doctor was summoned. And he stood frozen, staring at his daughter's lifeless body cradled in the arms of strangers. For the first time, the master of the house felt his world slipping from his control. And deep down, a truth he had tried to bury clawed its way to the surface. This was not about rules. This was not about servants. This was about love. And love was the one thing his wealth, his power, his arrogance could never command. But was it too late to undo the damage he had caused? The mansion was thrown into chaos. Servants ran through the halls with trembling hands. Doctors rushed upstairs carrying cases of medicine and instruments, and the air was pierced by the sound of muffled cries. Yet the center of it all, the master of the house, stood paralyzed, a man carved from stone whose cracks were finally showing. His daughter lay on the bed, her chest rising and falling weakly, her skin pale and damp with sweat. Every time her breath faltered, his own heart stopped with it. The doctor shook his head gravely as he checked her pulse. She is refusing everything. Food, water, medicine. She is losing the will to fight. His voice was calm, but the warning beneath it was sharp as a blade. If this continues, she will not last. The millionaire's jaw tightened. He wanted to rage, to order the doctor to fix it, to demand the impossible. But deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't the illness that was killing her now. It was loneliness. When the room cleared for a moment, he sat beside her bed, his large hand hovering inches above hers, trembling in a way it never had in a boardroom or in front of rivals. "You must fight," he whispered, his voice breaking for the first time in years. "You are all I have." Her eyelids fluttered open, her voice hoarse and frail. "No, Papa, I had someone else, and you sent her away." The words struck like a hammer to his chest. He tried to defend himself, to summon his usual mask of authority, but nothing came. His mouth opened and closed, his pride choking him into silence. Finally, his voice cracked out. "Do you think she cares more than I do? She is nothing compared to what I..." But she turned her face away, her small hand slipping from his. "She made me feel alive. You only make me feel alone." It was too much. He couldn't bear it. The fortress he had built around himself crumbled in an instant. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless, utterly powerless. And so, swallowing the pride that had ruled him for decades, he did what he thought he would never do. He summoned the maid back. The staff was stunned. Some thought they had misheard. Others believed the master had lost his mind. But within the hour, she was standing once again in the grand hall, her head bowed, her hands clasped nervously before her. She had expected anger, dismissal, perhaps even humiliation, but never this. He appeared at the top of the staircase, his face shadowed, his voice low. "She is asking for you." The maid's breath caught. She wanted to run, to refuse, to protect herself from what could be a cruel trick. But the desperation in his eyes she had only ever seen filled with contempt, told her this was no game. Without a word, she climbed the stairs, her steps echoing like a heartbeat in the silence. When she entered the room, the girl's eyes lit up instantly. "You came back." Her voice, weak and trembling, carried more joy than the walls of that mansion had heard in years. The maid rushed to her side, kneeling by the bed. "I'm here, little one. I'll stay as long as you need me." The girl's small hand reached for hers, clutching it tightly, as if afraid she might vanish again. Color returned to her cheeks, faint but real, and for the first time in days she drank a sip of water without protest. The doctor, watching from the doorway, exchanged a look with the master, a look that said more than words ever could. The millionaire stood frozen, his heart torn between relief and humiliation. He had been defeated, not by an enemy, not by a rival, but by kindness, by compassion, by a woman he had dismissed as nothing more than a servant. That night, as the house fell into uneasy silence, he lingered outside the forbidden room. Through the crack in the door, he saw them, his daughter resting peacefully, her small hands still clutching the maid's, her lips curled into the faintest smile. And in that moment, he realized something terrifying. All his wealth, his power, his rules, they meant nothing. What kept his daughter alive was something money could never buy, something he had almost destroyed. But he also knew one thing with brutal clarity. If he allowed this bond to continue, his world would change forever. The walls of his empire would no longer hold. His control would slip. His pride would collapse. And he wasn't sure if he was ready to face who he would be without them. The days that followed were unlike anything the mansion had seen before. The forbidden room, once a place of shadows and silence, was now filled with whispers, soft laughter, and a fragile kind of hope. The maid remained by the girl's side, tending to her with a patience and tenderness that no nurse, no doctor, had ever managed. She brushed the child's forehead when fever rose, told her stories when pain came, and hummed melodies that seemed to lull her into fragile dreams. The girl responded. Her eyes, once dim, now glowed faintly again. She ate small portions of food, drank water without resistance, and asked for things, small, ordinary things that were signs of life. Ribbons for her doll, a story before bed, a flower for her nightstand. And every time she asked, the maid gave. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. But what stunned the staff most was not the change in the girl. It was the presence of the master himself. He lingered at the door more often now, silent, watching. Sometimes he stepped inside, only to find himself invisible in his daughter's eyes, her world consumed entirely by the presence of the maid. It cut him deeper than he would admit. He was her father, her protector, her provider. Yet he had never been the one to bring her joy. That honor belonged now to someone else. One evening, he finally broke the silence. "Leave us," he said curtly to the maid as he entered the room. The girl's grip tightened around the maid's hand. "No, Papa, don't send her away again." His jaw clenched. He wanted to argue, to remind his daughter who held authority in this house. But the maid, calm and steady, looked him in the eye. "If she eats tonight, I'll leave without protest." The words shocked him. No one had ever bargained with him before, certainly not a servant. His instinct was to dismiss her immediately, to reassert control. But then he saw his daughter's pleading eyes, and his pride faltered. "Fine," he muttered. That night, the girl ate 3 spoonfuls of soup, more than she had in days. The maid smiled and whispered encouragement with each bite, while he sat in silence, defeated. When the bowl was nearly empty, the maid kept her word. She rose, bowed her head slightly, and left the room. But something strange happened. His daughter, instead of looking at him with gratitude, turned her face away, disappointment etched across her fragile features. "You should thank her, Papa." The words stung. Him, the man who owned half the city, who had been thanked by presidents and kings, now being told by his own daughter to thank a maid. That night, sleep refused him. He walked the empty corridors, his footsteps echoing like accusations. In the study, he poured wine after wine, but the firelight seemed to mock him. He saw his reflection in the glass window, a man who had built an empire but could not win the heart of his own child. The next morning, he found himself in the garden, staring at flowers he had not noticed in years. His hands, unaccustomed to anything but pens and contracts, touched a rose absent-mindedly. And for the first time in a long time, he wondered, when did I forget how to be human? The maid appeared behind him, her basket of linens in hand. She froze when she saw him there, unsure whether to retreat or continue. He turned slowly, his eyes weary but sharp. "You think you've won, don't you?" he asked quietly. Her brow furrowed. "This isn't a battle. To me, everything is a battle." She held his gaze, unflinching. "Then maybe that's why you're always alone." The words struck harder than she could have imagined. His lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. She had sliced through him with the precision of truth, and truth was harder to face than any enemy. He turned abruptly and walked away, but her words followed him like a ghost. "Maybe that's why you're always alone." That night, while his daughter slept peacefully with the maid at her side, the master sat once more in his study. He stared at the fire until it burned into embers, his mind spiraling through memories he had long buried, faces he had lost, words he had never spoken, love he had never learned to show. And he knew, though he would never admit it aloud, that the maid was right. The walls of his empire were not made of marble and gold. They were made of loneliness, and they were crumbling. The air in the mansion had shifted. The staff could feel it, like the heavy clouds before a storm or the hush of a church before confession. The master of the house walked with a stiffness he had never shown before, his face harder to read, his temper slower to rise. Yet the silence was not peace. It was the silence of a man caught in a war with himself. The maid, however, no longer moved like a shadow. Though she was careful, she no longer flinched at his gaze. The girl's health was fragile, but her spirit had awakened again, and that spark gave the maid a strange courage. She carried it in the way she spoke, in the way she smiled at the child, in the way she refused to break under the millionaire's stare. And though he despised it, part of him admired it. But admiration does not erase pride. Pride festers, pride resists, pride clings to control like a drowning man to driftwood. One afternoon, when the girl sat quietly on her bed, tracing her small fingers across the smooth skin of her bald head, she asked in a whisper, "Do you think people laugh when they see me like this?" The maid froze. The question felt like a dagger. She set aside the laundry she was folding and sat beside the girl. "No," she said firmly. "People see bravery. You are stronger than they can imagine." But the girl shook her head, her lips trembling. "I just want to look normal again." Her voice broke, and tears spilled down her pale cheeks. The maid wrapped her arms around her, holding her as if she could shield her from every cruel thought, every harsh glance. That night, when she returned to her modest room in the servants' quarters, she couldn't sleep. The girl's words echoed inside her head. She thought of her own younger brother, frail and sickly, whom she had cared for in their poverty. She thought of how hope was sometimes the only medicine. And then she remembered something, a small shop near the edge of the city, where wigs were sold for women recovering from illness. It was a reckless idea. She barely had enough money for herself, and yet the image of the girl's tearful face made her decision for her. The next morning, with her day's wages clutched tightly in her palm, she slipped out early before her duties began. She entered the shop, her heart racing, and left with a small box wrapped in tissue paper. It was not much, but to her it was everything she could give. That evening, when the house grew quiet, she slipped into the girl's room. The child's eyes widened when she saw the box. "What is that?" she asked, her voice tinged with wonder. The maid smiled softly, her own hands trembling. "A gift. For you." Carefully, she lifted the lid. Inside was a delicate wig, soft strands of hair, golden brown, not unlike the color the girl had once had. The child gasped, her small hand flying to her mouth. Tears filled her eyes before she even touched it. Do you like it?" the maid asked nervously. The girl nodded rapidly, unable to speak. Her hands reached for it, trembling as the maid gently placed it over her head. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then, when the girl looked at her reflection in the small mirror on the nightstand, her lips parted into a smile, radiant, fragile, but real. "I look like me again," she whispered. The maid's eyes stung with tears as she brushed a few strands into place. "You always looked like you. This just helps you remember it." The girl threw her arms around her, her weak body clinging with surprising strength. "Thank you," she whispered against her shoulder. "Thank you." But the moment was shattered by the sound of the door creaking open. The millionaire stood there, his eyes locked onto the scene, the wig, the tears, the embrace. For the first time in years, he was speechless. The sight hit him like a blow to the chest. His daughter, glowing with joy he hadn't seen since before the illness, and it was because of her. A maid, a nobody, a woman who had dared to step where no one else was allowed. The girl turned, her eyes shining. "Papa, look, she gave me back my hair." The maid froze, her body stiff with fear. She expected his wrath to fall on her like thunder. But he didn't speak. He didn't shout. He simply stared, his jaw tight, his fists trembling at his sides. Because in that moment, he realized something he had fought against his entire life. He, the man who had built everything, could give his daughter the world, doctors, treatments, palaces of marble and gold. But he could not give her what this simple act had given: dignity, hope, joy. And the humiliation of that truth burned him more than any insult ever could. The air in the room was so thick with silence, it seemed to crush every breath. The maid still knelt by the girl's side, her trembling hands frozen in the soft strands of the wig. The child's eyes gleamed with a joy so pure it illuminated her pale face, and for a fleeting moment, she looked less like a patient and more like a child again. But the man at the door was a storm barely contained. His chest rose and fell with unsteady breaths, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. For years, his word had been law, his rules unbreakable, his pride untouchable. And now, in one small act of defiance, a maid had given his daughter more than he ever could. He stepped into the room slowly, his shoes echoing on the wooden floor. The maid braced herself, her pulse hammering in her ears. She expected the words, the fury, the dismissal. She had prepared herself for it, but it didn't come. Instead, his gaze, usually so sharp, so merciless, was unfocused, as though he himself no longer recognized the ground beneath his feet. The girl beamed at him, lifting her tiny hands to touch the wig. "Papa, do you see? I look like me again." Something inside him cracked. The fire in his chest burned not with rage, but with shame. Shame for the months, years, he had hidden behind his fortress of perfection, demanding obedience while failing to give the one thing his daughter had needed most: tenderness. His lips parted, but no words came. His throat was tight, strangled by emotions he had locked away for too long. The maid, sensing the weight of the moment, lowered her eyes and whispered, "I only wanted her to smile again." Those words pierced him deeper than any insult ever could. For the first time in his life, he felt small, smaller than the empire he had built, smaller than the fortune that filled his coffers, smaller even than the child lying before him with eyes full of hope. He turned abruptly, his back to them, his shoulders trembling. The silence stretched painfully until finally, in a voice broken and hoarse, he said, "Leave us." The maid rose slowly, her heart sinking. She had known this would happen. Yet before she could take a step, the girl cried out, "No, Papa, please don't send her away again. Please, she makes me happy. Don't you want me to be happy?" He froze. The words struck like lightning, tearing through his pride. His daughter's fragile voice carried more power than any boardroom, any courtroom, any battlefield he had ever conquered. He turned back, his eyes glistening, not with anger, but with tears he could no longer contain. When he spoke again, his voice was unrecognizable. "Stay." The maid's breath caught. She stared at him, unsure if she had heard correctly. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, there was no fire, no arrogance, only defeat. "Stay," he repeated, softer this time, almost pleading. The girl's face lit up, her thin arms wrapping around the maid, as if to anchor her in place. Relief flooded the room, fragile but undeniable. The maid, still trembling, nodded silently, tears stinging her eyes. The millionaire turned away again, ashamed of the tears sliding down his face. He had spent a lifetime building walls of steel around his heart, and yet here, in this simple room, a maid and a sick child had torn them down in a single gesture. That night, for the first time in years, he sat by his daughter's bedside not as a master, not as a man of power, but as a father. He watched her sleep, the wig still in place, her lips curled into a peaceful smile. His hand trembled as he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, and he whispered words that had never before left his lips. "I'm sorry." The maid, seated quietly in the corner, heard it. She said nothing, but her eyes filled with tears. From that day on, the mansion changed. Slowly, painfully, but it changed. The staff no longer walked as though under a curse. The girl's laughter returned, filling the halls with warmth that even marble walls couldn't contain. And the man, still proud, still imperfect, began to learn, step by step, that wealth and power mean nothing without compassion. The world outside would never know the full story. They would still call him ruthless, arrogant, untouchable. But behind those tall glass windows, in the quiet of a room once forbidden, he was something else entirely, a man humbled by love. And all because one maid dared to break the rules. This story reminds us that no matter how high we rise, no matter how much we own, the smallest act of kindness can tear down walls stronger than steel. Compassion cannot be bought. It can only be given. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, if you had the chance to give hope to someone who had lost it, what would you do?